Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Toto Wolff is still talking about Max Verstappen, but this time he says no more. After confirming their driver lineup for the upcoming season, he says that Mercedes will no longer try and lure Max Verstappen away from Red Bull, but actually maybe the target for Toto will be the other way around. Simply allow Red Bull to continue their decline, and then it's going to be Max Verstappen knocking on Toto's door rather than the other way around. Very much interested in your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, just an interesting idea that was floated around today really, on what might happen after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this year. You guys might remember after 2022, when Sebastian Vettel was retiring, Fernando Alonso was coming into his seat in Aston Martin, but of course had just finished the year at Alpine. He drove an Aston Martin at the post-season test, and because of sponsor arrangements and all this stuff, it was a very simplistic liveried Aston Martin just in the racing green with the Aston Martin logo, and that was basically it. And this went down rather a treat, I'm not going to lie, going into the upcoming year, and therefore people have wondered, could Hamilton do a similar thing? We know that he's going to Ferrari. That's a locked-in done deal. He'll want to be in the Ferrari, you'd imagine, as quickly as possible after the season is over. So Alonso did it a couple of years ago. It shouldn't be impossible for Hamilton to potentially do the same. And if that was to be the case, of course, you'd think it might be a red Ferrari with like no sponsors on, which might even look better than normal. So yeah, there was just some talk about it. I thought I'd mention it because this was Alonso at Abu Dhabi a couple of years ago, going straight into the Aston Martin hospitality suite immediately after the end of the Grand Prix. And then not long afterwards, of course, was in this livery car. So we shall see if there's a number 44 Ferrari in a pure red livery on the track after Abu Dhabi, but I wasn't really thinking about it until it was mentioned on the Reddit, so I thought it would be quite interesting to at least consider. More drama as well on the engine side, as we've seen over the last few days. We mentioned this yesterday that rumour has it Renault's engine for 2026 was actually looking damn good and was exceeding their performance targets. But from a financial perspective, from a corporate mismanagement perspective, Renault decided to call it a day. And even to such an extent that Ferrari are now looking to sign several Renault engineers. Like, it's not like Renault's engine was atrocious. They've obviously had their problems over the last few years. They've made some good engines, they've made some bad engines, and it's the end of their time for now. You know how these companies are. They'll probably come back in at some point, right? But for now, Renault's Formula 1 engine project is over, and Ferrari are potentially leading the charge to sign some of their top guys in, because Ferrari know if they want to compete as best as they can in 2026, they're going to need a strong engine. We talked just yesterday about the fact that Mercedes are considered to have the strongest overall package, and, well, Ferrari are trying to match that, if not better at going forwards. But speaking of Renault, there's just so much politics on this team, right? I thought this is kind of fascinating from someone internally in that whole situation saying the deficit in power right now, Renault compared to the other teams, is we're talking 10 horsepower, 7 kilowatts, which, he reckons is only about 15% of the total deficit. So he says, look, the car isn't great, the engine isn't great, but it's not that bad. Like, they're only 10 horsepower roughly down on their competition. It's not the key reason why the team is struggling. And he reckons that actually the gearbox, like the poor gearbox performance, which is Enstone's responsibility, so it's pretty funny how it works, isn't it? You've got people who work for the Viri factory making the engines, and they say, well, our engine actually isn't that bad, look at their numbers, and it's the gearbox that's a problem, and that's not our fault, that's the fault of the guys at that factory. So, whether this is true or not, and there may be some validity to it, it's still pretty funny, isn't it, how the entire structure from a corporate perspective is just all finger pointing and blaming each and every direction. And as a result of all this drama and money playing a part, they've decided to call it a day, and, well, we believe that it's going to be Mercedes power that Alpine will be taking up for the upcoming season. Speaking of engines, though, it's funny in the sense that Mattia Binotto has basically said their engine isn't going to be that good in 2026. They're going to need to play some catch-up, really, which is expected because it's their first year making Formula 1 engines, certainly on this spec of regulations. They don't have the pedigree and the history that many of these other manufacturers do. But, Renault is dead for 2026, and maybe welcome back Renault engines, because Audi might well have a pretty terrible one as well. And of course, reliability is a big component as well of how successful these teams are actually going to be when those new regulations do come around in a couple of years' time. Let's talk Helmut Marko, though, because again, he's opening his mouth, he's yapping to the media, as he loves to do. he's talking about Sauber, Audi as they are effectively for 2026. Next year it's still kind of Sauber. But the belief is that they might choose Bottas, they might choose Colapinto, they might choose Bortoletto. But Marco, his opinion is that Bottas should 100% not have that seat. He reckons even, the likes of Mick Schumacher or any of the other names I mentioned would be better suited because I guess the theory goes, you've got Hülkenberg, your car's underperforming, you've got some experience, but you need to on some level invest for the future, get someone else in instead and don't sign Bottas. And I get that perspective, but also it's interesting what Marco says because sometimes what Marco says about these type of situations, for example, at Red Bull, you'd think that, well, why not put Tsunoda in the Red Bull alongside Perez? And that would be the conclusion of Marco's perspective on basically everything. The reality is Marco doesn't make all the shots at Red Bull, and that's why things don't go as Marco says they should go. And the same way with Horner, because obviously other people also have power in that organisation. It's just always such an absolute mess in their communications at Red Bull because they have Horner, the team principal, and they have Marco, the chief advisor, both talking to the media on their opinions and what's happening from their perspective, and often they are vastly different despite working for the same company effectively. So Marco, rumour has it, makes sense, that he continues to rate Tsunoda highly. We know that Marco rates Yuki, right? That's a known thing. But Horner, for whatever reason, doesn't want him in the team, whether he thinks he's not ready, or from an outright pace perspective, or from a mindset, mentality, character perspective, and also whether he would be a good partner to Max in the sense that Yuki is not going to go to Red Bull and be satisfied being, the water boy. You know what I mean? He's going to want to do as best as he possibly can. That is Yuki's mentality, and maybe Horner's concerned about that. I don't think that Yuki would go to Red Bull and actually properly challenge Max from a pace perspective, but let's say Yuki's ahead and Max needs the points. Will Yuki give up the place easily or whatever? Right? He's going to fight hard. I think that's the nature of his character. And I think that's a good trait as a Formula 1 driver, but not necessarily a good trait as a second driver to Max at Red Bull. You can make the point. So Marco wants to consider Yuki for the Perez seat, you'd think. But clearly Horner doesn't necessarily agree. And also Marco said this, that for the future, Red Bull will look to its junior drivers, which of course he kind of has to say because he leads up effectively their junior program with Red Bull and has done since, Dietrich Mateschitz put him in charge of it basically all those years ago. So obviously he's going to say, well, Iwasa, Hadjar, Lindblad, these other guys they have in their junior development program, they are going to be the drivers considered for the seat, rather than an established star like Russell. But obviously Horner the other day made the wildly different assertion that, well, they are considering Russell and they'd be unwise not to because he is available for 2026, as we well know. Horner said, or Toto said, oh, he's just stirring the pot, as he always does. But, we talked about this in some detail because Horner discussing Russell as an option for Red Bull implies a potential Verstappen replacement. Because I don't think it's in Horner's interests necessarily at all to put Russell and Verstappen next to each other or, anyone in that seat against Verstappen who could potentially be something of a threat just because otherwise surely Yuki might be there already. I don't know, intrigued to your perspective. But definitely Horner's saying, well, George is up for consideration, and Marco's saying, what do you mean about George? He's not going anywhere near our team. We're going to sign our rookie guys. Lawson, for example, is going to come through the ranks as well with the RB seat for the rest of the year. So just confusing messaging as ever from Red Bull. And even the other day we have Horner saying, well, Daniel Ricciardo, it's not over yet. Maybe you can come back. So it's all an absolute shambles, to be honest. The question is, how good is their lineup going to be next season, Red Bull? And also for the other teams as well. They have Max Verstappen. They may have Sergio Perez. They may not. James Vowles, obviously yesterday, made the point that the Mercedes is going to be the strongest engine in 2026, and on some level there's going to be bias in play because his team has Mercedes engines, so he's going to be bigging them up understandably, in the same way that he's going to be bigging up his driver lineup. He says that Williams have the strongest driver lineup with Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. Now, it's a strong lineup, for sure. It's a strong lineup. I wouldn't say it's really anywhere near the strongest. I mean, Norris and, certainly in my opinion, Norris and Piastri clears. You can certainly look at the Mercedes pairing as well and say that, well, Russell, is he better than Sainz and Albon? In my opinion, probably yes. And how's Antonelli going to fare? I mean, we don't really know. That's a question mark. And then the strongest driver lineup by absolutely no questions at all is Hamilton Leclerc. There's just no way that it's not. I mean, it's probably the strongest lineup we've had in Formula 1 in many a year. I mean, we're potentially talking back to Hamilton, Rosberg, and even in those days, there's a question, right? So it's eras like that we're talking about here with the likes of Hamilton, Leclerc, in my opinion, in terms of pure pace and consistency and championship potential. So yeah, I don't really buy this idea, but fair enough. He's going to give his perspective, and obviously it's a subjective opinion at the end of the day, what the stronger lineup on the grid is actually going to be. But Toto Wolff is not satisfied with having Russell, Antonelli forever. Now, he says that he is, but obviously he is going to say that because he's kind of made these decisions and he's over there at Mercedes calling the shots. But for the few months that preceded the Antonelli confirmation, Toto was, as he even describes himself, flirting, in those words, with Max Verstappen, trying to get him onto his team. And this is why, after Horner made the comments about George, Toto was like, well, here he goes, he's kind of getting revenge or whatever for me doing what I did to Max. But Toto was very clear that they want to sign Max Verstappen, and he's not said, oh, well, we're no longer interested. They're still interested, obviously. It's just Toto says, I'm not going to make it so public anymore, which makes sense because now he has an actual driver lineup pairing. But the funny thing about this is to me that everyone knew that driver pairing for months. Like, it was never really in doubt that it was going to be Russell Antonelli. It was always the main rumour. The initial rumour was that Antonelli was like plan A, and then even as soon as Hamilton left, Antonelli was plan A, and then plan B was like Alonso, and then he re-signed to Aston Martin, and then plan S or whatever, right, like the new plan that came on the market was potentially Max Verstappen. So Toto tried that a little bit. It became clear it wasn't going to happen for this year at the very least, so they locked in Antonelli, and that was a done deal. But even while Antonelli was not yet locked in, he was still talking about Max basically all of the time, trying to find reasons, especially as Mercedes got better and as Red Bull got worse, for Max to potentially leave the team. Because if there's any driver that any team on the grid would love to have right now, apart from maybe Ferrari, because I'm sure they're pretty happy with what they've got going on, it's obviously Max Verstappen, right? And Red Bull, I would say, are very lucky to have Max Verstappen. If they didn't, I think both of the championships this year would look rather different indeed. But Toto was asked the question on his pursuit of Max Verstappen, and he's still talking about him, right? Like, he's still going on about him on some capacity. And I even think that despite him saying in this quote, like, oh, well, I'm not so interested anymore, I'm not going to flirt outside of the relationship or whatever, like, it's still kind of clear that he's interested in getting Max in his team at some point. And what that means, given that I think Russell is the man that should be scared about this possibility, because it's clear that Toto and the team believes that Antonelli is potentially the future. We may or may not see evidence of that this year. If we don't, I still think they're going to give him another year. Like, I think there's no way Antonelli comes in for 1 year and then he's gone. I think they'll at least give him a couple of seasons to see whether he's got what it takes, because they're confident that he has. So I think it's Russell the one that should be concerned. But yeah, Toto says, we're sitting back. I'm not going to flirt anymore outside of the relationship. It doesn't work. I'm not flirting outside, he says, on his pursuit of Max Verstappen. So it's all rather entertaining. And, well, he says, I'm not going to talk about Max anymore. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that those conversations won't be ongoing, because yes, Toto has been trying to speak with Max and have those conversations, but Toto is likely still in some conversation with Jos Verstappen, right? And that's been the key talking point. There was even a rumour a couple of weeks ago now that Jos Verstappen had made a verbal agreement with Toto to bring Max to Mercedes if the circumstances align. Toto isn't going to turn that down. Jos is going to say yes to that because he prefers Toto than he does Horner, and there is a feeling that in 2026 the Mercedes engine is going to be stronger. Potentially they're going to have a stronger car in 2026 than Red Bull will do, and therefore there's a few reasons why that decision would make sense. And if Jos is on board, then Toto doesn't necessarily even have to speak with Max for that relationship to potentially bear fruit at some point down the line. And I also think the benefit for Toto really in this situation is that he can just kind of let the performances do the talking on some level, right? Like, I think he said everything he needs to say about Max and to Jos over the last few months to set this, motion rolling. I mean, even Toto said a few months ago that it's like it has to happen that Max and Mercedes duo up again at some point. Like, it may happen years down the line, but, he's convinced it's going to happen, and he's trying to manifest that reality, it seems. But I think he said everything that he needs to say, and the performance over the coming months will determine what happens, not just for the rest of this year. Like, if Max does lose the Drivers' Championship, that will not be because Max has failed to perform, that will be because the car has continued to regress and the Austin upgrade package didn't work. If that happens, then, there's a serious risk of Max just deciding, all right, Red Bull have lost their way entirely, I'm out of here, even if Mercedes haven't massively turned it around. And certainly for next year, it's a big conversation topic. There's even talk today that 2025, if the Austin upgrade package doesn't work, could be even worse than what's happened this year so far. So, we'll see how it goes, but Max is obviously going to be a target. Toto might say that, well, we're not so interested, but that doesn't necessarily mean what's happening behind the scenes is aligning with what's happening in reality. I thought this is quite fascinating, though, as well, looking at the performances. Now, obviously, the car performance matters on some level here. Like, when Albon and Gasly are in the car, respectively compared to the competition, maybe the car was stronger, you could argue. And, they were 69 points, 61 points over those 12 rounds. Perez would have scored 54 over the last 12 rounds had he not crashed in Baku, estimating his finishing position. But Perez has actually scored only 39 points, which is pretty bad. I mean, there's no other way to look at it, especially because Max has still scored a fair few. And the car is close to being the fastest. Maybe on some days the Red Bull still is the fastest. Usually it is the McLaren, though, nowadays for sure. But it is just interesting to look at, isn't it? How, yes, car performance does have an impact here, but there's no doubt that Perez has not been performing on an individual level, and his performances are on parallel with, if not literally worse, quite substantially worse, than his predecessors when they were fired in their, previous 12 races. So, but it seems like Perez is going to stay around, at least for the time being. And just one final interesting thing for you guys. The Austin Grand Prix is coming up soon, in a couple of weeks, and towards the end of October, and apparently the ticket sales for it have taken a massive spike after Max has no longer started winning races, or stopped winning races, basically. Now, I guess there's a debate here on how much this is actually true in reality, in the sense that, is it true that ever since Max stopped winning, the ticket sales have gone up, or is that like a natural phenomenon as the race gets closer and closer? People start to buy tickets at around about that time in the year when coincidentally Max's dominance did fall off. But I do think this is probably true to some extent. People expected after the first few rounds of this 2024 season that it was the same old story. Max is going to win every race for the season again. There's going to be no sort of championship fight. Why bother going to the race when you know who's going to win? That's kind of how it was last year. So, it's understandable. You could argue, well, the fans shouldn't do this. They should be fans of the sport and Formula One. But, look, a better season is going to attract more ticket sales. It just is what it is. It's better going to a Grand Prix when you don't know who's going to win on the weekends, which is now the case, and it's not been the case for some time. So, whether you fully buy this or not, intrigue your thoughts in the comments below, but nonetheless, it is rather interesting. So hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.